All right, so represented here is the skull of a bovine, so a cow. And we're going to go over this one first so that you recognize all the different anatomical bones that make up the skull. And then we'll go through a horse, a younger goat, and then a hog, okay? So when we're looking at the bovine skull, there are some defining characteristics that sort of help us in determining what bones are where. And so all bones are going to have this little line here, kind of looks like a sewed jagged line, and that is called a suture. When we get to the articulations chapter, the joint chapter, this is actually truly a joint between these two bones, these bones, okay? So that's how we're going to be identifying them, all right? So let's start off on top. The top, where the head is, the animal's looking at you, the little beady eyes are coming out right here. This is the frontal bone. And you can see where this suture begins, and now we have the nasal bone. There's a fracture here, but this was filled in by a bony suture. Okay, so this is the nasal. This is the incisive bone here. When we turn the skull to the side, okay, we have the orbit, okay, the orbit. And the orbit where the tear duct is the lacrimal bone. Then we have the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone articulates with the temporal bone. They call this the zygomatic arch, or you could call it the temporal zygomatic arch, okay? And this is going to articulate with the parietal bone. And the parietal bone in the skull of the bovine is a little bit different. You can see the suture line right here and the suture line right here. So this is temporal, and this is all parietal right here, okay? And parietal goes all the way into the back up here. So the parietal is wrapped all the way around right up in here. It's a little bit camouflaged in the bovine skull because you have tendon and ligament attachments that are here, so the rough border up here, part of the parietal. And then here is the occipital, and then here is the occipital condyles. And the occipital condyles articulate or join with the first vertebrae. Okay? Going underneath. Okay. We have the maxilla. This is all the maxilla. In here. This is the palatine bone right here. Sometimes you'll see it as a palatine process. But this is all palatine, so if you put your tongue at the top of the roof of your mouth, that's the palate, okay? And it articulates with the maxillary bone, okay? Now there's one other bone structure here. Let me pull this off. And this is a pneumatic bone that I went over in the gross morphological anatomy lecture. The pneumatic bone is going to be a thin bone. You can see how thin it is. And it contains, it's empty, it's air, it's not solid. This helps with the overall mass of the skull. It actually decreases its mass and helps with equilibrium when we have barometric pressure changes, such as with altitude. The other components that I'd like you to be aware of are inside and underneath the nasal cavity. On either side of the nasal cavity, you have here this sort of scroll-shaped, thin, porous bone. That bone is called the nasal conchae. This warms and humidifies the air. It's also very vascular, so it cools off the blood before it gets to the brain. And then right here in the center, where we have upraised sort of V-shaped tissue here, this is going to be the vomer bone, V-O-M-E-R. And again, all of these bone names are in chapter 4, okay? The vomer bone is where we actually have the nasal septum, the tissue, the soft tissue that divides the nasal cavity, okay? All right, over here, we still have a bovine. I just wanted to show you the inside of the actual pneumatic bone, okay? So that's the maxillary sinus, thin bone, with the air cavity in it, okay? The other component that I'd like to go over is right here. This is called the corneal process. This is the corneal process, okay? And at a certain point, it's no longer solid, and it becomes hollowed out. And that will then empty into the sinuses of the frontal bone, okay? Sinuses of the frontal bone, okay? So let's move over here to a horse. Okay, this horse was put out of its misery. Now I don't want you to get confused between the sutures that you see here, where you have the squiggly lines looking like it's sewn together, versus the fractures. Okay, this animal has lots of fractures. So again, we have the frontal bone, and we have the parietal bone right here, and you can see it bordering with the occipital bone, which begins here. Okay. The parietal articulates with the temporal bone. You can see here that we've got the suture. Temporal articulates with the zygomatic. Zygomatic bone articulates with the lacrimal bone. Now if you look inside of the cavity, the orbit, you'll see a hole there, and that's the lacrimal duct. This is where eye secretions empty into the nasal cavity. So when you cry, I don't know if you've ever wondered, when you cry like crazy and then your nose starts running, it's because the tears are overflowing in your eyes and then they're coming out your nose, okay? Again, the maxillary, the incisive bone, the nasal bone. I'm going to turn this all the way over, okay? We have the palate bone here, maxillary. And then let's look, we've got partial occipital bone right here. Remember that it articulated with the parietal, and it's here. Very different than the bovine skull. Very different. All right, let's move over to the hog. In the hog, we've got the complete skull. And in addition to the other skulls, we have the mandible here. The mandible is only held together with the skull of the animals through soft tissue. So when that soft tissue degrades, you're going to have separation of this mandible from the rest of the skull features. Okay? So we have the mandible, we have the maxillary bone, lacrimal, zygomatic, articulates with the temporal. In this hog skull, you don't see the sutures as well. They've all been filled in when they were preparing this particular tissue. But this is all temporal, and you can see a little bit remnant of suture here. And then this all is parietal on either side. This is going to be frontal, okay? In the back, we have all occipital. And then these are the occipital condyles, to which we have articulation with the first vertebrae, the atlas of the vertebral column, okay? Here we have our nasal, our incisive. Let's see if my teeth fall out of this bad boy. They always do. Ooh, let me keep them in. Okay. In the back, so you can see the incisive articulating with the maxilla and then the palatine bones. Okay. Get that set up right. Looks a little wonky-do. There. All right, over here, you have your goat skull, corneal process articulating with the frontal bone. Very nice suture. On both sides is frontal. The orbit, the nasal, the maxilla, the lacrimal, the zygomatic. Zygomatic articulating with the temporal. Suture temporal articulating with the parietal. So this is all parietal. All the way around, parietal. And then this is all the occipital and the occipital condyles. Let's see, I believe in this one you can see the nasal conchae, the scrolls, nice porous tissue, and then a really nice vomer bone there, again where soft tissue that creates a septum divides each of the nasal cavities. Okay. Palatine bone, maxilla. And in here you can actually see some of the maxillary sinus. I don't know if we can get in there and see it. Pneumatic bone right there. Okay? All right, that is the bovine skull.